Most people believe strength is something you demonstrate, something you prove publicly, something that exists only when others can see it, acknowledge it, or applaud it. And from the moment we are young, we are conditioned to associate effort with visibility, performance with praise, and progress with recognition. So naturally, when no one is watching, when no one is commenting, when no one is validating the struggle, the mind starts to question whether the effort even matters at all. And this is where most people unknowingly abandon the very place where real strength is forged, because strength was never meant to be loud, it was never meant to be advertised, and it was never meant to be dependent on an audience. And the silent samurai understood this deeply, long before modern distractions trained people to confuse attention with power, because the samurai knew that any strength that requires witnesses collapses the moment the crowd disappears. And that is why the most important phase of growth is the phase nobody respects, the phase nobody celebrates, the phase nobody even notices, the phase where effort feels invisible, unrewarded, and painfully quiet. Because this is the phase that reveals whether discipline is internal or borrowed, whether identity is real or performative, and whether you are building strength or simply rehearsing the image of it. And the problem is not that people don't want to be strong. The problem is that most people want the feeling of being strong without paying the psychological cost of becoming it. And that cost is invisibility, because invisibility strips away the ego's favorite fuel, which is validation. And when validation disappears, motivation collapses for those who are never truly committed. Because commitment that depends on recognition is not commitment at all. It is negotiation. And the moment the reward is delayed, the mind starts to whisper that the effort is pointless, that tomorrow will be better, that rest is deserved, that consistency can wait. And this is how strength dies quietly, not through failure, but through distraction disguised as comfort. And the silent samurai trained specifically to survive this phase, the phase where there is no proof of progress, no external feedback, and no emotional payoff. Because they understood that strength is not a reaction to results. Strength is the cause of results, and causes always exist before effects become visible. Yet modern minds are conditioned to only respect outcomes, not processes, which is why people only admire strength once it is obvious, once it is undeniable, once it is already built. But almost no one respects the process that creates it, and even fewer are willing to endure that process themselves. Because the process is lonely, repetitive, and brutally unrewarding in the early stages. And this is where the illusion of visible strength becomes dangerous, because visible strength feels productive, it feels motivating, it feels socially reinforced, but it also trains dependence on external energy, and external energy is unstable by nature, because applause fades, attention shifts, and novelty wears off, while internal strength, the kind built when no one is watching, compounds quietly, without emotional spikes, without dramatic breakthroughs, without public milestones. And this quiet compounding is exactly why it feels so uncomfortable, because it denies the ego everything it wants, recognition, reassurance, and proof, and instead forces the mind to rely on something far more uncomfortable, trust in the process, without evidence. And this is why most people prefer visible effort over invisible discipline, because visible effort offers immediate emotional relief, while invisible discipline demands long-term psychological endurance. And the samurai chose endurance, not because it was noble, but because it was effective, because warriors who relied on motivation failed under pressure. Warriors who relied on habit survived chaos, and habit is built through repetition. Repetition requires consistency, and consistency requires doing the work even when there is no emotional reward attached to it. And this is the part most people misunderstand. Strength does not feel strong while it is being built. It feels boring, it feels frustrating, it feels unnecessary, and it often feels like nothing is happening at all, because the nervous system adapts before the mind recognizes change. And by the time the results become visible, the real transformation has already occurred internally, which is why people are always shocked when someone suddenly seems different, calmer, more grounded, more confident, because they did not witness the hundreds of quiet repetitions that rewired that person's identity. They only see the final version and assume it appeared overnight, when in reality it was forged slowly, invisibly, and without witnesses. And this misunderstanding creates a dangerous cycle because people chase visible transformation instead of internal transformation. They want before and after moments without enduring the in-between, and the in-between is where strength actually lives. The unglamorous mornings, the silent discipline, the private restraint, the moments where quitting would go unnoticed by everyone except you. And this is where the real test exists, not whether you can perform when others are watching, but whether you can remain consistent when no one cares. Because when no one is watching, there is no social pressure to maintain standards, no reputation to protect, no external consequence for failure. And that is why integrity is born in isolation, because integrity is who you are when no reward or punishment is present. And strength built without witnesses becomes part of your nervous system, not part of your image, which is why it does not need to be defended, explained, or proven. It simply exists, quietly influencing your posture, your decisions, your reactions, and your tolerance for chaos. And this is why the silent samurai trained away from crowds, not to hide, but to remove distortion, because attention distorts effort. It turns performance into discipline, and performance always leaks energy, while discipline preserves it. And the more you rely on being seen, the more fragile your strength becomes, because the moment attention disappears, motivation follows. But when you build strength in silence, silence itself becomes familiar, comforting, and stabilizing. And this changes everything, because silence is where most people break. They cannot stand the absence of stimulation, feedback, or validation, and so they fill the void with noise, distractions, and excuses, while the samurai use silence as a training ground, because silence removes external references and forces confrontation with the self. And the self, when stripped of distractions, reveals its weaknesses immediately: impatience, doubt, inconsistency, and avoidance. And these weaknesses cannot be masked when no one is watching, because there is no one to impress, only habits to maintain. And habits either exist or they don't. And this is the brutal honesty of invisible strength. It exposes whether your discipline is real or imagined, because imagination thrives on attention, but discipline survives on repetition. And repetition does not care how you feel. It only responds to whether you show up or not. And this is why strength built in silence lasts longer than strength built in public, because public strength is reactive. It depends on conditions, while silent strength is proactive. It exists regardless of circumstances. And once you experience this, once you realize that the most powerful version of yourself is built without witnesses, something shifts internally. You stop craving recognition. You stop explaining your effort. You stop announcing your intentions, because you understand that announcing effort often replaces effort, that talking about discipline releases dopamine without the work, and that premature praise weakens commitment. And the samurai avoided this trap by keeping training private, intentions hidden, and progress quiet, because they understood that energy spent explaining is energy not spent executing, and execution is what builds strength, not intention, not motivation, not inspiration. And this is why strength feels heavier before it feels lighter, because in the beginning, you are carrying both the effort and the doubt, both the discipline and the uncertainty. But over time, as habits solidify, doubt fades, effort becomes automatic, and strength becomes less about force and more about stability. And stability is invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply holds under pressure, under stress, under unpredictability. And this is why people are drawn to calm individuals without knowing why, because calmness is often the external signal of internal strength. And internal strength is almost always built when no one is watching, when there is no incentive to continue except self-respect. And self-respect is the rarest form of motivation, because it cannot be borrowed. It must be earned privately through consistent action without witnesses. And this is the code the silent samurai lived by, not because it was poetic, but because it worked. Because when battle arrived, there was no audience, no applause, no time to prepare, only instinct, habit, and internal discipline. And the same principle applies to modern life. Pressure exposes preparation, not intention. and preparation happens in silence, away from praise, away from validation, away from distraction. And if you can learn to build strength there, in that quiet, unrewarded space, you develop something most people never touch: unshakable self-trust, because you know what you've done when no one was watching, and that knowledge does not need to be shared, proven, or defended. It simply exists, quietly influencing your posture, your decisions, your reactions, and your tolerance for chaos.
Why almost no one survives that place? Because the moment effort becomes invisible, the mind begins to rebel. And this rebellion is subtle at first. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It suggests that rest is logical, that skipping today doesn't matter, that consistency can resume tomorrow. And the danger is not the thought itself, but how reasonable it sounds. Because the brain is wired to conserve energy, seek comfort, and avoid uncertainty. And invisible effort offers no immediate reward to override those instincts, which is why the silent training phase feels uniquely heavy, not physically, but psychologically, because you are asking your nervous system to invest energy without proof of return, and that violates everything modern conditioning has taught it. Since we live in a world where feedback is instant, validation is constant, and progress is measured publicly. And when those signals disappear, the mind interprets silence as failure, not training. And this misinterpretation is where most people quit, not because they lack potential, but because they mistake the absence of feedback for the absence of progress. And the silent samurai trained specifically to resist this illusion, because they understood that silence is not emptiness. Silence is compression. It is pressure without release, and pressure without release is what forges durability. And this is why early discipline feels heavier than later mastery, because in the beginning you are carrying uncertainty, impatience, and self-doubt alongside the habit itself, and each repetition feels isolated, disconnected, and unrewarded. But what is actually happening beneath awareness is neurological alignment, the slow rewiring of identity, where actions begin to define self-perception instead of intentions. And this shift is uncomfortable because it removes excuses, because once identity starts forming around behavior, inconsistency becomes painful, not externally, but internally. And this internal discomfort is what weak people try to escape by seeking audiences, accountability partners, announcements, and external pressure. Because external pressure temporarily replaces internal discipline, but it never lasts. And when it fades, the habit collapses with it, which is why most people cycle through motivation instead of building consistency, while the silent samurai accepted discomfort as a signal of alignment, not danger, because discomfort meant the nervous system was adapting to a higher standard, and adaptation always feels like resistance before it feels like strength. And this is the paradox most people never understand. The feeling of weakness often precedes real strength, while the feeling of strength often precedes collapse. Because feeling strong can be fueled by excitement, novelty, or validation, while real strength is built through monotony, repetition, and restraint. And restraint is invisible by nature. No one sees the urge you resisted. No one applauds the distraction you ignored. No one acknowledges the discipline you maintained when quitting would have gone unnoticed. And yet those moments are the exact moments that build self-trust. Because self-trust is not built by success, it is built by follow-through. And follow-through only matters when there is an option to quit without consequence. And this is why invisible training is so powerful, because it removes external enforcement and forces internal alignment. And internal alignment is what separates those who collapse under pressure from those who remain steady. Because when pressure arrives, there is no time for motivation, no audience to impress, no explanation to offer. Only habit and instinct remain. And instinct is trained, not chosen in the moment. And this is why the silent samurai prioritized private repetition over public performance, because performance impresses others, but repetition transforms the self. And transformation is always lonely before it is respected, because people respect results, not preparation. And preparation feels pointless until it suddenly doesn't. Until one day you realize that reactions have slowed, emotions are regulated, focus is sharper, and decisions feel grounded. And there is no dramatic moment to mark this shift, no clear milestone, no public acknowledgement, which is why many people fail to notice their own growth until someone else comments on it, saying, "You seem different, calmer, more disciplined." And what they are sensing is not effort, but integration, the point where discipline stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural, because identity has caught up with behavior. And this hidden payoff of invisible strength, it does not just change what you do, it changes who you are, quietly, without announcement. And this quiet identity shift is what makes strength durable, because durable strength does not depend on mood, environment, or recognition. It exists even when conditions are unfavorable. And this is why people who build strength publicly often struggle privately, while those who build privately appear calm publicly. Because calm is not an emotion, it is a byproduct of preparedness, and preparedness is built when no one is watching, through choices that feel insignificant in isolation, but powerful in accumulation. And accumulation is boring to observe, but devastating in effect, because small disciplines compound into behavioral gravity, a presence that doesn't need to assert itself because it is felt. And this presence unsettles people who rely on performance, because performance requires reaction, while presence does not. And this is why silent strength often triggers discomfort in others, because it exposes the gap between appearance and substance, between intention and execution. And this exposure is not intentional, it is simply unavoidable, because behavior reveals truth without accusation, and truth is uncomfortable for those who avoid it. And this is why people often minimize, mock, or misunderstand disciplined individuals, because acknowledging their consistency would require confronting their own inconsistency, and avoidance feels safer than accountability. But the silent samurai never adjusted behavior to make others comfortable, because comfort was never the goal, capability was. And capability is built through sustained effort under minimal stimulation, where boredom becomes a training tool instead of an enemy, because boredom strips away novelty and leaves only commitment. And commitment is the real test, not excitement, not motivation, not inspiration, but commitment to repetition when nothing feels rewarding. And this is why strength built in silence lasts longer than strength built in intensity, because intensity spikes and crashes, while silence stabilizes and compounds. And once you experience this compounding, once you feel the internal solidity that comes from knowing you did the work without witnesses, something fundamental changes. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop needing reassurance. You stop measuring progress externally, because you have internal proof, and internal proof is unshakable, because it is private, earned, and undeniable. And this internal proof is what allows the silent samurai to move through chaos without panic, through provocation without reaction, and through uncertainty without collapse, because the work has already been done, quietly, consistently, and without applause. And this is the final truth most people never accept. Strength is not built to be seen. It is built to be relied upon. And reliance only matters when things go wrong, when pressure rises, when no one is there to help, and when excuses no longer work. And if you have built strength in those quiet moments, when quitting would have been invisible and comfort would have been easy, then when the moment arrives that demands resilience, discipline, and clarity, you will not need to rise to the occasion, because you will already be there, steady, prepared, and grounded. Not because you are special, but because you trained when no one was watching.
Strength reaches its final and most dangerous form when the world stops being your mirror and you no longer need evidence that you are becoming stronger. Because by this point, you have crossed a line most people never even see, a quiet threshold where discipline no longer feels heroic, effort no longer feels dramatic, and progress no longer needs witnesses. And this is where the silent samurai is truly forged, not in suffering, not in struggle, but in consistency without emotion. Because when no one is watching, there is no adrenaline, no applause, no validation loop feeding your identity. There is only repetition. And repetition is where most people break, because repetition exposes the truth about motivation. It reveals whether you were chasing growth or chasing feeling important. And this is why so many people burn out after the initial surge of inspiration, because inspiration thrives on novelty, but strength thrives on boredom. And boredom terrifies the ego, because boredom strips away meaning. It removes the story. It leaves you alone with the action itself. And when action has no emotional reward attached, the mind begins to resist. It whispers that the effort is pointless, that you deserve rest, that no one cares anyway. And that whisper is not weakness, it is the final test. Because at this stage, the mind is trying to reclaim control. It wants to reinsert comfort. It wants to turn discipline back into a transaction, effort in exchange for praise. But true strength is non-transactional. It does not ask what it will get. It only asks what must be done. And this is why the strongest people in history were not constantly motivated. They were structured. They removed decision-making. They did not wake up and ask how they felt. They asked what the process required, and then they executed, regardless of emotion. Because emotion is unreliable. Emotion fluctuates. Emotion reacts to environment. But structure is silent and unchanging. And when no one is watching, structure becomes your only ally, because there is no external pressure to perform, no fear of judgment to push you forward. And this is why solitude is such a powerful accelerator, because in solitude, excuses echo louder. There is no social friction to keep you accountable. And yet this is precisely why solitude reveals your real level, because if you can maintain discipline when there are no consequences for failure, you are no longer disciplined, you are aligned. And alignment is when action feels inevitable rather than forced. And this is where the samurai enters flow, not the flow of excitement, but the flow of inevitability, where the body moves before the mind can debate, where habits have been burned so deeply into the nervous system that resistance no longer forms. And this is why the outside world often misunderstands quiet strength. They think it is luck, timing, talent, or confidence, but they never see the invisible hours where the person trained their nervous system to obey without argument. They never see the nights where nothing dramatic happened, where progress was microscopic, where quitting would have changed nothing externally, but continuing changed everything internally. Because every time you act without being seen, you send a signal to yourself that you are trustworthy, that you follow through even when there is no reward. And self-trust compounds faster than any skill. Because once you trust yourself, you stop negotiating, you stop needing motivation, you stop waiting for permission. And this is why people who build strength in silence move differently. They are not rushed, they are not reactive, they are not desperate to prove anything, because they already proved it to the only audience that mattered, themselves. And this internal confirmation creates an unshakable calm, a calm that unnerves others because it does not fluctuate with circumstance, it does not spike with success or collapse with failure, it remains steady. And steadiness is the most intimidating form of power because it cannot be manipulated. And this is why loud people often crumble under pressure, while quiet ones endure. Because loudness is a coping mechanism. It is energy leaking outward, while silence is containment. And containment allows force to build. Just like a blade is useless without a sheath, strength without restraint becomes chaos, but restraint without weakness becomes mastery.
And mastery is invisible until it is unavoidable, until one day the world notices results that seem disproportionate to effort, unaware that the effort was simply hidden, accumulated patiently beyond visibility. And this is where envy often arises, because people compare outcomes without understanding processes. They see the calm under fire and assume emotional numbness. They see consistency and assume obsession. But the truth is simpler. The person stopped relying on feeling good to act. They stopped tying identity to performance. They stopped making progress theatrical. And when you stop making progress theatrical, you stop leaking energy. And that energy is redirected inward, refining execution, sharpening awareness, deepening control. And control over self is the highest form of power, because once you control your own impulses, distractions, reactions, and doubts, the external world loses its leverage over you. And this is why the final stage of strength is not aggression, it is silence. Not silence born of fear, but silence born of completion. Because there is nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. And when you reach this stage, you will notice something strange. The desire to be seen fades, not because you feel unworthy, but because visibility no longer adds anything. And this is when life becomes lighter, because you stop performing and start moving. You stop thinking and start flowing. You stop narrating your journey and start living it. And this is why the silent samurai does not announce growth, does not post progress, does not seek validation, because the work itself is enough, the discipline itself is enough, the alignment itself is enough. And when the moment comes, when pressure arrives, when chaos enters, when others freeze or overreact, you will not rise to the occasion, you will fall back on what you built in the dark. And what you built in the dark will not fail you, because it was constructed without illusion, without shortcuts, without an audience. And this is the final truth. Strength built when no one is watching is not just stronger, it is purer, it is quieter, it is harder to shake. And once you taste that kind of strength, you will never again need the noise, because silence will feel like home.
By the time strength reaches its fourth phase, it no longer announces itself even internally, because the mind has stopped labeling effort as strength and stopped labeling difficulty as hardship. And this is the most misunderstood stage of all, because from the outside it looks like detachment, even apathy. But in truth, it is precision. It is the absence of internal noise, the removal of unnecessary friction between intention and action. And this is what most people never experience because they abandon the path right before this silence arrives. They mistake the fading of excitement for failure. They assume that if progress no longer feels dramatic, then it must no longer be happening. But the opposite is true, because drama is a sign of instability, not growth. And when the internal system stabilizes, the emotional spikes flatten, the highs become calmer, the lows become shallower, and consistency replaces intensity. And consistency is where real power multiplies, because consistency does not drain you, it conserves you. It allows effort to become sustainable, and sustainability is the difference between temporary transformation and permanent identity shift. An identity shift is the real goal, because once your actions align with who you believe you are, discipline disappears. There is no longer a battle to do the right thing, it simply happens. And this is why strength built in private eventually becomes effortless in public, not because the tasks become easier, but because resistance dissolves. And resistance is what exhausts people, not the work itself. The work is neutral. It is the negotiation with the self that drains energy, the constant questioning, the constant bargaining, the constant emotional commentary. And when that commentary fades, time stretches, focus deepens, and action sharpens. And this is when flow stops being something you chase and starts being something you enter deliberately.
because flow is not luck, it is alignment between challenge and capability, and that alignment is built through quiet repetition, through countless unseen refinements, through mistakes corrected without witnesses, through adjustments made without praise, and each adjustment compounds, not outwardly but inwardly, until one day the inner structure becomes so solid that external conditions no longer dictate performance. And this is where strength becomes dangerous, because it no longer depends on mood, environment, or outcome. It operates regardless. And this is why people who reach this stage appear calm even when stakes are high, because they are not improvising, they are executing something already rehearsed internally thousands of times. And this internal rehearsal is something that can only happen in solitude, because solitude removes distraction, it removes performance pressure, it removes the need to appear competent, and allows you to actually become competent. And competence is quiet, it does not seek attention, it simply works. And this is why mastery often feels boring to outsiders, because there is no spectacle, no visible struggle, no dramatic swings, only clean execution. And clean execution intimidates because it cannot be rattled. And this is why people try to provoke those who are strong in silence. They try to pull reactions out of them, because reaction is weakness, reaction is loss of control. And when you do not react, you reveal dominance without aggression. You signal that you are operating from a deeper level. And this unsettles those who still depend on emotional leverage, because emotion is a tool of control. And when you remove emotion from your decision-making, you become uncontrollable, not reckless, but independent. And independence is the highest threat to systems that rely on predictability. And this is why society subtly discourages solitude, discourages silence, discourages self-directed discipline, because a person who does not need external validation cannot be easily steered, cannot be easily sold fear, cannot be easily distracted. And this is why the silent samurai path feels lonely, because it separates you from the noise-driven rhythm of the world. It places you on a different timeline, one where growth is measured internally rather than externally. And this internal measurement changes how you experience time itself. Days feel fuller, actions feel cleaner, regret loses its grip because you are no longer constantly betraying your own intentions, and self-respect begins to replace self-criticism, not because you are perfect, but because you are consistent. And consistency builds trust, and trust builds calm, and calm allows perception to sharpen. And when perception sharpens, you see opportunities others miss, you anticipate shifts before they happen, you move earlier, quieter, and with less wasted motion. And this efficiency is not rushed, it is patient, because patience is no longer passive, it is strategic. It is the ability to wait without weakening. And waiting without weakening is only possible when your strength is internalized, when it does not require stimulation, when it does not decay in silence. And this is the final refinement, the moment when solitude stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like protection, protection of focus, protection of energy, protection of direction. And at this point, the outside world may still be loud, chaotic, reactive, but it no longer penetrates because you are no longer porous, you are sealed. And sealed strength does not leak, it accumulates. And when it is finally required, when pressure converges, when action must be taken decisively, there is no hesitation, no overthinking, no internal debate, only movement, precise, controlled, and final. And this is why strength built when no one is watching eventually reshapes reality itself, because it is not built for display, it is built for function, and function always outlasts performance. And when your strength is functional, the world adjusts to you rather than the other way around, not because you dominate it, but because you are no longer dependent on it. And independence is the ultimate form of power, quiet, stable, unshakable. And once you reach this stage, you understand the deepest truth of the silent samurai, that the greatest victories are not won in battle, but in the thousands of unseen moments where you chose alignment over comfort, silence over noise, structure over impulse, and continued moving forward even when nothing was watching, because that was the moment you were truly free.